Why would the most feared mountain cowboy in Silver Creek pay $500 for 4 sisters he had never met? 500, all 4. The auction hammer stopped in midair. Dust scratched Catherine's throat as Magnus Brennan stepped through the silent livestock yard. Silas reached for the money, but the scarred cowboy covered it with one enormous hand. No one separates these 4 sisters. Then Catherine stepped down and asked the question that made Magnus go still. What did you just buy? What would you have done in her place? Tell me below. The auctioneer slapped one palm against the rail. $50. Who'll give me 60? Laughter rolled across the Silver Creek livestock yard. Catherine Crawford stood beneath the July sun with her 3 sisters pressed close behind her. Dust clung to the hem of her brown dress. Sweat ran beneath her collar. She could smell horses, manure, hot timber, and whiskey drifting from the saloon across the road. She kept her chin up. Hannah's fingers were locked around hers on the left. Beatrice held Hannah. Josephine, only 19, stood at the end of the chain, with her eyes fixed on the planks beneath their boots. Their uncle Silas Crawford waited beside the platform with a folded paper in his coat pocket. He had called it debt. Catherine called it theft. Their father had been dead 6 months. In that time, Silas had taken control of the farm, sold cattle, emptied their mother's jewelry box, and insisted every meal the sisters ate increased what they owed him. Now he meant to settle that supposed debt by sending them away as labor. 75, a man near the stock pens called. The auctioneer grinned. 75, 4 strong women. Who gives me 80? Another man shouted that he only needed 2 for his logging camp. Someone else wanted Hannah for a mining kitchen. Josephine's hand suddenly went cold. Catherine. She barely made a sound. Catherine turned her head. I can't go without you. For the first time that afternoon, Catherine nearly lost control. She tightened her grip instead. Then don't. But if they separate us, they won't. Catherine had no idea how she could keep that promise. Still, Josephine looked at her and nodded. The auctioneer raised his hand again. $80? A deep voice came from beyond the ring. 500. The yard went still. Even the auctioneer lowered his hand. A man stepped out from beneath the shade of the feed store awning. Catherine had noticed him earlier because it was difficult not to. He was extraordinarily tall, with broad shoulders beneath a weathered dark coat and a face that looked carved by winter. A pale scar ran from near his left eye toward his jaw. Whispers moved through the crowd. Brennan. Magnus Brennan. Magnus walked toward the platform. $500, he repeated. All 4. Silas pushed through the crowd. Now wait. Magnus stopped. Silas looked from him to the sisters. Why would you pay that kind of money? Magnus's expression did not change. Silas gave an uneasy laugh. For 4 women like them? Catherine felt Beatrice shrink closer. Magnus finally looked at Silas. Your paper says $500 settles the Crawford debt and releases every claim you make against their labor. Silas's smile disappeared. Magnus held out his hand. The paper. For several seconds, Silas did nothing. Then greed won. He pulled the folded agreement from his coat. Magnus read every line before laying $500 on the auctioneer's table. He made the auctioneer sign as witness, then folded the receipt and placed it inside his coat. Silas reached for the money. Magnus put one hand over it. One thing first. Silas froze. Magnus looked toward the platform. No one separates these 4 sisters. Nobody laughed this time. The auctioneer brought down his hammer. Catherine released Hannah's hand and descended before anyone could offer assistance. Her boots struck the dirt hard. Magnus towered over her. She looked straight up at him. What did you just buy? A murmur passed through the yard. Magnus studied her face. Nothing that belongs to me. Catherine said nothing. He removed the receipt from his coat and offered it to her. She read it twice. "You're free to come to Brennan Ranch," he said. "There's paid work, food, and rooms. If you decide you want somewhere else, I'll see you safely there. And if we decide to leave you, you leave." No hesitation. That frightened Catherine in a different way. She knew threats. She knew bargains disguised as kindness. She did not know what to do with a man who opened the door and refused to push her through it. Behind her, Josephine had reached the edge of the platform. She stopped. Magnus approached, then halted several feet away. He did not touch her. He simply waited. Josephine stared at his scarred face, then slowly extended one trembling hand. Only then did Magnus raise his own. By late afternoon, Silver Creek was behind them. Catherine rode beside Magnus, not behind him. She watched how he slowed his horse whenever Josephine fell back, how he checked Beatrice's saddle strap without making a show of it, how he answered Hannah's questions plainly. Near sundown, they camped beside a cold mountain creek. Magnus cooked beans with salt pork and warmed biscuits in a covered iron pan. He filled 4 tin plates before serving himself. Catherine looked at the portions. "You think we're weak?" Magnus glanced at her. "I didn't say you were weak." He handed her a plate. "I said somebody starved you." The answer silenced her. Southern night settled over the pines. Much later, with her sisters asleep beneath blankets, Catherine found Magnus sitting across the fire with his rifle resting beside him. "Why?" she asked. He looked up. $500. 4 strangers. Why? For a long time only the creek answered. Then Magnus stared into the coals. Because once there were 2 people somebody should have come for. Catherine waited. "My wife and my little girl." Something changed in his face. Nobody did. He stood before Catherine could ask anything else and walked beyond the firelight to take first watch. Catherine lay down beside her sisters, but sleep would not come. Under the Montana stars, she listened to Magnus Brennan's boots making slow circles around their camp. That morning she had feared what the giant cowboy might want from them. Now another question kept her awake. Who had Magnus Brennan failed to save? And why did it seem as though he had been paying for it ever since? Catherine carried those questions through the next 2 days. Magnus offered no answers. He rode at the head of their little party through pine country and narrow mountain trails, speaking mostly when the road demanded it. He checked the horses before dawn, boiled coffee in a blackened pot, and made sure Josephine was settled in her saddle before climbing onto his own. By the 3rd morning, the trail rose sharply through a stand of ponderosa pine. Then the trees opened. Catherine pulled her mare to a stop. Bitterroot Valley stretched below them, green and gold beneath the morning sun. Cattle dotted the grasslands. Split-rail fences crossed the lower meadows. Beyond them stood barns, corrals, a smokehouse, several bunkhouses, and a small schoolhouse with its shutters closed. At the center stood a broad log home with a stone chimney. Magnus stopped beside her. "Home." Catherine looked at him. "You're home. For now." His gaze remained on the valley. "After that, you decide." The words followed her all the way down the hill. At Brennan Ranch, Catherine expected to be shown toward the bunkhouse. Instead, Magnus carried their few bundles through the front door. The house was large but strangely quiet. Real glass filled the windows. A long dining table stood beneath a hanging oil lamp. The parlor fireplace was wide enough to hold logs Catherine could barely have lifted alone. There were 6 bedrooms. Magnus pointed upstairs. "Choose whichever ones you want." Beatrice stared at him. "You mean for us?" "I don't need 6 bedrooms." Josephine touched the quilt on one bed as though afraid it might disappear. That afternoon, Magnus asked them what work they knew. Not what labor Silas had forced upon them. What they actually knew. Hannah admitted she could keep accounts and teach mathematics and literature. Magnus handed her the ranch ledgers. Beatrice told him she had learned basic remedies and nursing from their mother. "There's always somebody getting kicked, cut, or foolish around cattle," Magnus said. "You'll be useful." Josephine nearly whispered her answer. "I paint." Magnus considered the upstairs windows. "South room gets the best light." Josephine blinked. Then came Catherine. "Horses." Magnus raised one eyebrow. "My father taught me." The next morning he walked her to the main corral. "Then the remuda is yours." Catherine stared at him. "You trust me with every saddle horse on this ranch?" "If I didn't, I wouldn't have said it." That was how their life began. Not with promises, with work. Weeks passed. Hannah brought order to ledgers Magnus had kept in stacks tied with twine. Beatrice became a familiar sight, carrying clean cloth and willow bark tea between the bunkhouse and barns. Josephine began leaving charcoal sketches near open windows, and Catherine took command of the horses. One morning, a nervous bay mare fought Magnus at the corral fence. "You're crowding her," Catherine said. 3 ranch hands suddenly became very interested in their boots. Magnus looked over. Catherine expected resistance. Instead, he stepped back. "Show me." She approached sideways, lowered her hand, and waited. The mare's ears softened. Within a minute, the animal was breathing against Catherine's palm. Magnus watched. "You were right." That was all. But Catherine thought about it for the rest of the day. Soon, a tin cup of coffee began appearing on the corral rail before sunrise. Magnus never said he brought it. Catherine never thanked him. She simply started repairing his worn tack before he noticed it needed repair. One afternoon, a cracked buckle cut her palm. Magnus saw the blood and reached for her, then stopped. "May I?" Catherine looked at his hand. That hand could have closed around her wrist without effort. Instead, it waited. She placed her palm in it. Magnus cleaned the cut and wrapped it with linen from the tack room. His fingers were careful. When he finished, neither moved. Then Catherine slowly withdrew her hand. That evening, she caught herself staring at the white bandage. A few days later, Josephine found something else. She had gone to the barn looking for sunset light when she saw Magnus kneeling beside an old wooden box. Inside lay a tiny carved horse. He shut the lid when he noticed her. Josephine started to retreat. "I'm sorry." Magnus shook his head. "My daughters." Josephine stopped. "I made it when she was 2. She did not ask anything more. Later she told Catherine only, "Some things hurt worse when you hide them." That night, Catherine found Magnus alone on the porch. The valley was dark except for lanterns near the bunkhouse. "Sarah?" Catherine asked quietly. Magnus's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "My wife." He stared toward the mountains. "Our daughter got sick one winter. Sarah followed. I rode for help." His voice roughened. "Snow closed the road. By the time I got back..." He stopped. Catherine did not ask him to finish. For 20 years, he explained, he had built fences, barns, corrals, things he could repair, things he could protect if he worked hard enough. "You think loving them was your failure?" Catherine said. Magnus looked at her. "No." She held his gaze. "You think failing to save them was..." From somewhere inside the house came Josephine's laugh. Clear, unexpected. Magnus turned toward the sound. For a moment, the scarred corner of his mouth almost lifted. Catherine spoke softly. "You don't have to erase them for this house to live again." Before Magnus could answer, hoofbeats sounded beyond the ranch gate. A rider appeared in the moonlight. He carried news from Silver Creek. Silas Crawford was telling anyone who would listen that Magnus Brennan had stolen his nieces. Worse, he claimed the $500 had settled an old expense and nothing more. By midnight, Hannah had their father's surviving papers spread across the dining table. Receipts, cattle tallies, Mortgage notes, pages covered in Silas Crawford's handwriting. Catherine came downstairs and found her sister still working beneath the oil lamp. "Hannah?" Hannah did not look up. She pointed at one cattle sale, then another, then a mortgage bearing a date after their father's death. "Catherine," her finger stopped beside a signature neither woman recognized. "I don't think Silas came after us because he misses controlling us." Hannah turned another page. Her face had gone pale. "I think he's afraid of what happens if we learn what he stole." By morning, the dining table had disappeared beneath paper. Hannah worked with 2 sharpened pencils, their father's old receipts, and Magnus's account book opened beside them for comparison. Catherine stood behind her while Beatrice heated coffee on the stove, and Josephine watched the eastern windows turn gray. The pattern was ugly. Cattle had been sold without money entering the estate. A mortgage appeared after their father's death. Family valuables had vanished beneath vague entries marked expenses. Each time Silas needed another excuse to control them, the debt somehow grew. "He needs us quiet," Catherine said. Hannah nodded. "And close enough that we can't challenge him." Before noon, a horse came hard up the ranch road. The rider wore a deputy's badge. Magnus met him at the gate. The deputy handed over folded papers bearing the county seal. Silas accused Magnus of coercing the Silver Creek transaction, interfering with the Crawford estate, and removing the sisters, while Silas still claimed authority over their labor and property interests. Magnus read the last page. "Nobody takes them." Catherine stepped beside him. "Magnus," his eyes stayed on the deputy, "don't fight our battle for us." That made him look at her. Something closed behind his pale eyes. Catherine lowered her voice. "Stand with us. That's different." For a moment, the only sound was the gate chain tapping against the post. Then Magnus folded the papers. "All right." 3 days later, Catherine saw dust beyond the lower pasture. One rider became 4, then 7. Silas Crawford rode at the front. Sheriff Mercer was beside him. Magnus came out of the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Inside," he told the sisters. Catherine stayed where she was. "If he came for me, he'll hear me answer him." Magnus looked at her. Months earlier, Catherine would have expected an order. Instead, he stepped aside. Hannah joined her. Beatrice took Josephine's hand. Together, the 4 sisters climbed the porch steps. Sheriff Mercer dismounted first. "I'd rather settle this without trouble, Brennan." "So would I." Silas swung down behind him. "I've come for my family," Catherine's voice carried from the porch. "You mean the family you starved?" Silas looked up. "The family whose cattle you sold, whose property disappeared, the family you put on a livestock platform?" His expression hardened. "You always did have too much to say." Magnus moved once, only one step, then stopped. Catherine noticed. He was keeping his promise, standing with her, not speaking for her. Sheriff Mercer removed his hat and looked toward the porch. "Hannah Crawford, do you wish to return with your uncle?" "No." "Beatrice?" "No." Mercer looked at Josephine. She had gone white around the mouth. Silas smiled. Josephine's fingers tightened around the porch rail. Then she lifted her head. "No." Silas's smile vanished. Finally, Mercer faced Catherine. "And you?" Catherine descended one step. "We choose to stay." Nobody moved. A horse stamped near the gate. Silas suddenly crossed the yard. "You ungrateful little—" He reached toward Josephine. He never touched her. Magnus caught his wrist. The movement was so quick that Catherine heard Beatrice gasp. Magnus did not strike him. He simply held Silas there until the man stopped struggling. Leather creaked. A horse snorted. Magnus's voice was almost quiet. "You heard her say no." He released him. Silas stumbled backward, clutching his wrist. Sheriff Mercer stepped between them. "That's enough." Silas stared at him. Arrest Brennan. For what? He's holding them. Mercer looked toward the four women. No, they're staying where they say they feel safe until this matter goes before the proper authority. Silas's face darkened. You'll regret this. He climbed into his saddle. Then he looked past Mercer toward Magnus. Enjoy your new family, Brennan. A thin smile appeared. Until morning. He rode away. The others followed. Inside the house, nobody celebrated. Beatrice put the kettle on and forgot to light the stove. Josephine stood at that window until Hannah gently drew the curtain. Catherine paced beside the stone fireplace. Magnus remained near the door. As long as I'm breathing, he said, nobody drags you out of this house. Beatrice looked at him. Why? Magnus frowned. Why do we matter this much? His gaze traveled across the room. The books Hannah had stacked beside the ledgers. Josephine's charcoal drawing near the window. Beatrice's jars on the kitchen shelf. Catherine's riding gloves drying beside his own. Because you walked into a dead house and made it live. His voice dropped. You're the family I never expected to have again. Josephine wiped her cheek. Hannah lowered her eyes. Catherine stood perfectly still. Magnus looked at her last. Something passed between them that neither was ready to name. Then a chair scraped sharply across the floor. Hannah had risen. She hurried back to Silas's papers. Until morning. Catherine turned. What? That's what he said. Hannah opened the estate notice the deputy had delivered and held it nearer the lamp. Her finger moved down the page, then stopped. Oh, Lord. Magnus crossed the room. Hannah looked up. The writers were never the real attack. She spread their father's documents beside the notice. Silas had arranged a proceeding in Silver Creek the following morning. He intended to secure his position over the disputed Crawford estate before the sisters could formally challenge his accounts and establish their independence from his household. If he succeeded, the stolen cattle, mortgages, and missing property could disappear beneath years of argument. And Silas would have new papers to wave every time he came after them. Catherine looked toward the dark windows. How long do we have? Hannah glanced at the clock. Magnus already knew. He reached for his coat. Until sunrise. An hour later, lamplight still burned across the dining table. Hannah had sent a ranch hand to fetch a frontier attorney who lived several miles down the valley. The older man arrived after midnight with dust on his boots, spectacles low on his nose, and a leather case stuffed with territorial forms. He read Silas's notice twice. Then he examined the Silver Creek receipt. Crawford's case isn't as strong as he wants you to believe, he said. But if he gets his version entered first, untangling it could take years. Hannah pushed her reconstructed accounts toward him. These prove discrepancies. They help considerably. His eyes settled on Catherine. But you're the eldest daughter. Silas is building his argument around the claim that you and your sisters remain dependent upon the Crawford household and its estate arrangements. Catherine folded her arms. I haven't lived under his roof since the day he sold our labor. I know. The attorney hesitated. There is one way to make that separation considerably harder for him to dispute before morning. The room went quiet. Catherine understood before he said it. Marriage, a lawful household of her own, established with a recognized landholder, would strike directly at Silas's claim of dependency, while Hannah challenged his accounts. Nobody spoke. Then Beatrice slowly looked toward Magnus. Hannah did the same. Josephine followed. Magnus stood near the fireplace. No. The word came so quickly Catherine almost flinched. For one awful second, she could hear nothing but the clock on the mantel. She looked at him. Magnus's face changed when he saw hers. Catherine. You don't have to explain. Yes, I do. He crossed the room but stopped several feet from her. I met you standing on a block while men put prices on your future. His voice was low. I won't use your fear to get your hand. Catherine's anger vanished before it could fully form. Magnus looked toward the papers. If there's another way, we take it. If there isn't, we ride into Silver Creek and fight him with what we have. You'd risk losing? I'd risk everything I own before I turned your freedom into another bargain. No one answered that. The attorney quietly gathered several papers. Hannah touched Beatrice's arm. Within minutes, Catherine and Magnus were alone. The mantel clock ticked. Outside, wind moved through the pines. Magnus left first. Catherine waited perhaps 30 seconds before following him. She found him in the barn beneath a hanging lantern. He was saddling horses, not preparing to run, preparing to fight Silas without asking anything from her. Catherine stopped beside the stall. Magnus, his hands kept working the cinch. If Silas disappeared tonight, would you still refuse me? His hands stopped. He did not turn around. That silence told Catherine everything. She walked toward him. You paid Silas's claim. Magnus finally looked at her. Another step. You fed us. Another. You gave my sisters rooms and work. She was close enough now to see the uncertainty in a man who had faced 7 armed riders without blinking. You stood between Josephine and him. Catherine. And none of that bought this. She held out her hand. Magnus stared at it. Once, Catherine had stood on rough planks while strangers decided what her future was worth. Now her boots rested on solid earth. No auctioneer, no crowd, no Silas. Only the smell of hay and saddle leather, the soft shifting of horses, and Magnus Brennan waiting for an answer he refused to demand. If I give you my hand because I want you, Magnus Brennan. Her voice softened. Will you take it? His fingers closed around hers, slowly, carefully. Catherine felt his hand tremble once. That nearly undid her. You're certain? Yes. If tomorrow were different? Yes. If there were no hearing? Yes. Magnus swallowed. Catherine squeezed his hand. I am not asking you to save me. She stepped closer. I'm asking you to stand with me. Before dawn, they gathered in the front room. The ceremony was plain and brief, witnessed by Hannah, Beatrice, Josephine, and the men required to make the record proper. No flowers, no music. Catherine wore the same dark dress she had worn to supper. Magnus wore a clean white shirt beneath his black coat. Before the vows, he leaned toward her. You can still stop. Catherine looked into his pale eyes. That's why I'm doing this. He waited. Because I can. When it was done, Magnus hesitated even then. Catherine almost smiled. She rose slightly and kissed him first. Nothing hurried. Nothing claimed. When they separated, Josephine was crying openly. Beatrice pretended she wasn't. Hannah held the estate papers against her chest and said, We need to ride. Outside, the eastern sky had begun turning silver. Magnus helped Catherine into the saddle only after she offered her hand. Then he mounted beside her. The ranch gate swung open. 5 horses started down the road toward Silver Creek. Catherine rode at Magnus's side, her sisters close behind. In her saddlebag lay her father's records. Inside Magnus's coat rested the $500 receipt, and on Catherine's hand was a simple ring she had accepted freely. The sun broke across the Bitterroot Mountains behind them. Ahead waited the same town where men had once stood beneath the July heat and placed prices on 4 sisters. This time Catherine Crawford was riding back by choice. Silver Creek was awake when they arrived. Wagons crowded the main road. Horses stood tied outside the mercantile. Men who remembered the livestock yard stopped talking when Magnus rode past. Catherine noticed their faces. She did not lower hers. Hannah carried the reconstructed accounts beneath one arm. Beatrice guarded their father's correspondence inside a leather folder. Josephine walked between them without staring at the ground. Magnus stayed beside Catherine, not ahead of her. Inside the county office, Silas was already waiting. His confidence lasted until he noticed Catherine's ring. Then he laughed. "So that's how Brennan finished buying you." Magnus moved slightly. Catherine touched his sleeve. He stopped. She faced Silas herself. "He never bought me." Silas pointed toward Magnus. $500 says otherwise." Magnus removed the Silver Creek receipt and laid it on the table. Catherine placed one finger beside the wording. "The money settled the debt you claimed we owed and released your claim against our labor." Silas's mouth tightened. "It did not purchase us." The morning stretched on. The auctioneer was called and reluctantly confirmed the transaction he had witnessed. Hannah opened her ledgers and walked through cattle sales that never reached the estate accounts, unexplained mortgages, missing proceeds, and signatures dated after their father's death. Beatrice produced letters and household records that contradicted Silas's supposed expenses. Then the sisters spoke, one after another. No shouting, no grand speeches. Just dates, meals withheld, property taken, work demanded, and the afternoon Silas placed them on that platform. Josephine's voice shook when her turn came, but it did not disappear. Silas watched her with the old expectation that fear would eventually make her silent. Josephine finished every word. Finally, Catherine stood. Silas leaned forward. "You had nowhere else to go. Brennan knew that." Catherine looked at Magnus. He made no move to rescue her from the question. That was why she loved him. She turned back. "He gave me somewhere to go." Silas scoffed. "And he gave me permission to leave." The room became still. Catherine rested her hand on the table. "I stayed." That was the part Silas had never understood. Freedom could not be measured by who opened the door. It was measured by whether the person standing beyond it could choose to walk away. By afternoon, Silas's attempt to secure uncontested control of the Crawford estate had failed. His authority over the disputed property was suspended pending a full accounting. Further sales of livestock and land were barred, while the missing money and questionable documents were examined. There was no dramatic gunfight, no cheering crowd. Silas simply gathered his hat and walked from the room with less power than he had carried into it. Magnus barely watched him leave. He was watching Catherine. Months later, autumn settled over Brennan Ranch. The abandoned schoolhouse had opened again. Hannah's voice could be heard through its windows as she taught arithmetic to ranch children. Beatrice kept clean bandages, dried herbs, and bottles arranged on a kitchen shelf that had once collected dust. Josephine's paintings appeared throughout the house, and when ranch hands needed decisions about horses, they no longer automatically searched for Magnus. They looked for Catherine. One evening she entered the parlor and found Magnus beside the mantel. The little carved horse rested in his palm. Once he would have closed the box. Now he remained still. Catherine came beside him. "Her favorite?" Magnus nodded. "She carried it everywhere." Catherine gently took the carving and placed it on the mantel. She did not hide it. She did not ask him to put the past away. Sarah had existed. Their daughter had existed. Loving Catherine did not require Magnus to love them less. Later, as sunset turned the Bitterroot Mountains copper and purple, Catherine joined Magnus on the porch. Behind them came the sounds of a house alive. A pan clattered in the kitchen. Hannah called for Beatrice. Josephine laughed near the barn. A horse answered from the pasture. Magnus rested both forearms on the porch rail. "I thought I brought 4 women home." Catherine waited. His eyes stayed on the valley. "Turns out you brought mine back." Catherine understood. 20 years earlier, grief had emptied this house until Magnus could hear winter wind moving through the chimney. Now there were muddy boots near the door, books on the table, paintings on the walls, coffee cups left beside ledgers, arguments over supper, laughter where silence used to live. Magnus lowered one hand onto the rail between them. He did not reach for her. Catherine looked at that scarred, calloused hand. It was the hand that had waited beneath Josephine at the auction platform instead of grabbing her. The hand that had cooked their first supper in the mountains. The hand that had wrapped Catherine's injured palm only after asking permission. The hand that had stopped Silas. The hand that had trembled in the barn before sunrise when Catherine offered hers freely. Magnus waited, so Catherine crossed the small distance between them. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers. Below the porch, her three sisters remained together. Behind them, the house that had forgotten laughter was full of it. Ahead, the mountains darkened beneath the last light of day. Magnus Brennan had once stood before a cruel crowd and declared that no one would separate four sisters. But that was not where their love story ended. It ended here in the quiet, with no debt, no bargain, no frightened woman standing on a platform. Only a cowboy who had finally learned that love did not mean holding someone so tightly they could never be lost. And a woman free enough to leave, who reached for his hand and chose to stay. Maybe that is the part worth carrying with us. Because imagine standing where Catherine once stood, with other people deciding what your life was worth, then finding yourself beside someone strong enough to protect you, but gentle enough not to possess you. How long would it take before you trusted that open door? How much courage would it take to stay when, for the first time, leaving was truly your choice? Magnus gave Catherine and her sisters shelter, but they gave something back that money could never purchase. They filled an empty house with footsteps, arguments, work, coffee, paintings, and laughter. And Catherine showed a grieving man that loving again did not betray the people he had lost. Sometimes a second chance does not erase the scars. It simply gives them somewhere peaceful to rest. Maybe family is partly blood, but sometimes family is also the people who stand beside you when standing in front of you would be easier. And maybe the deepest kind of love is not the hand that holds you back. It is the hand that waits for you to reach first. If you had been in Catherine's place, would you have trusted Magnus enough to stay? Tell me in the comments. And if stories of courage, healing, mystery, and unexpected love still mean something to you, you're always welcome to subscribe. There are more stories waiting down the trail.